Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and today we're diving into one of the most common questions that I get from new flight simmers, which is how to get yourself lined up with and then land on a runway without having to rely on any type of approach loaded up. The best place to start for any landing is actually to work backwards and pick the runway that you want to land on first. So if we open up our EFB, it's going to have all of the information that we need. In almost all situations, you want to land into the wind as much as possible. So if you have a look at the airport that you're landing at, over on the weather tab, the wind direction will be shown right here whenever it's available. For today, it's blowing from 0 to 0 heading into Friday Harbor. So if we head over to the runways tab now, we can figure out which runways line up the best with that wind direction. We've only got the two runways to pick from, 16 and 34, and the EFB is recommending us runway 34 since that's going to be as close to a headwind as we can get, so that's what we'll use for our planning. If there's no weather report available where you're landing, say if it's a very small airfield, you could just overfly it first to try to spot a windsock, which will give you a rough idea of the wind direction and speed. But what I usually do in that situation is just rely on the wind details from the avionics instead. All of the Garmin units can display the wind like this, but you have to dig around a bit in the menus to bring it up depending on which avionics that you have on board, but it's really useful when there's no other information available. Now that our runway's picked, we can move on to figuring out how we'll line ourselves up with it, regardless of the direction that we're flying in from, by using a traffic pattern or circuit to get on final, which is basically like a track that goes around the airport. Most of the time, a pattern is done with left-hand turns since that's on the pilot's side, although some airports also have right-hand traffic. But for the most part, I stick with left-hand patterns unless there's a reason to change it, like for example, if there's terrain in the way. There are generally three legs that we need to fly to get lined up with the runway, and the first of those is the downwind leg, which runs parallel to our runway but in the opposite direction, and then that's followed by a 90-degree turn onto base. The base leg is pretty short, and then we do one last 90-degree turn onto final, which is what's going to line us up with the runway, so we'll work backwards from there. Although the runway's identifier is 34, it isn't exactly on a heading of 340, but for a visual approach that should be good enough. So our base leg needs to be 90 degrees offset from that, which I usually just figure out by looking at the heading indicator, and it's going to be 250 in this case. Our downwind leg is 180 degrees opposite of our final runway heading, so in other words, you can just look at what the opposite runway number is, which is 16, so that means our downwind leg will be on a heading of 160. Now that we know what headings we need to fly, the next thing that we need to figure out is how we'll get on the downwind leg, and that's going to depend mostly on the direction that we're flying in from, although it can vary depending on where you're flying in the world. We're coming in from the east, and since we're doing a left-hand pattern, what makes the most sense is to overfly the field first and then join the downwind leg in one of two different ways, with the first option being to make a left turn and join directly after we've crossed the field, and this is the way that I tend to do it most of the time since it's a bit quicker. If you're doing a group flight though, and there are other people in the pattern, you might cut some people off doing it this way, so this next technique will actually make more sense in that situation. What you'll want to do then is to fly further afield and then spin yourself around so that you can come back towards the runway and then join the downwind leg at a 45-degree angle, which gives you more time to space yourself out with other traffic. If we were coming in from the opposite direction, on the other hand, this 45-degree entry that we just looked at makes a lot of sense there too, since we're already on the correct side to join from that direction. The last possibility is that you're coming in almost directly on the runway heading, and in that situation you could decide to do a straight-in approach, or if you need to go to the other runway, you can join on the downwind leg directly and then do a normal base and final leg. This will cover you for most situations, but there will always be times where you have to adjust it in some way, especially when you're landing in a valley of some kind. That'll often require some tweaking to make the pattern work. As you come up on the airfield, you'll want your airspeed to be just above flap extension speed, and what I've seen done most commonly in flight sim is to overfly the field at or just above pattern altitude, which is normally 1,000 feet above ground level. From here, since we're doing the direct entry, we really only need to wait a few seconds before starting our turn towards downwind, since we're trying to be anywhere between half a mile to a mile offset from the runway. This is where having wing views bound to look around quickly comes in handy, because we're trying to do this all visually, but even if you fly a bit further away like I did here, it's not the end of the world either, and you get better at it with time. If you aren't already, you'll want to get the rest of the way down to pattern altitude at this point and keep an eye on the runway, because the next thing that we want to see is when we're abeam of the runway threshold, which is a bit hidden behind the trees there. That's actually my marker for when I'll bring the flaps to the approach position, which will be different from plane to plane, so you'll want to look it up to be sure, but it's usually either the first or second notch. The ideal time to turn onto base is when you're about 45 degrees offset from the runway threshold, but I've gone a little bit further than that today, and as you get more experience, you can make that turn a little bit earlier to tighten things up. The longer we stay on the downwind leg though, the longer that you'll have on final, and for your first few circuits, it's really not a bad idea to give yourself a good 3 miles, since it'll be easier to get used to when to start descending. As you're rolling out on the base leg, you'll want to keep an eye on the runway, and this is where I recommend going to flaps full, because it'll help get you down to final approach speed and give you more time on final. This is also when I start to descend, which we'll look at more in a second, and we'll also start our last turn to the runway, which is definitely the hardest part to get right, and I still screw this up way more than I'd like to admit. What I found works until you get the hang of it is to break that final turn into 245-degree turns, which makes it easier to see the runway, judge your turn, and your descent rate all at the same time. The first thing that you have to evaluate as you roll out on final is what your sight picture looks like. Are you too high, too low, or right on profile? And for a visual approach, you can judge this solely by looking at the shape of the runway. I'm getting a bit higher on profile than I should be here, and when that happens, the runway starts to look longer, skinnier, and more rectangular than it should. Ideally, an approach is flown with a 3-degree descent rate, and that's what our middle picture would give us, but since we're too high right now, we're going to have to descend faster to be able to catch up. An easy way to calculate what an ideal descent rate should look like is to take your ground speed, divide it by 2, and then add a 0 to it. So for this approach, we're doing 90 knots, and that would equate out to about a 450 foot per minute descent. Since we're too high on profile though, we'll need to descend faster than that to catch up, and anywhere between 200 to 300 feet per minute more should do the trick until our sight picture starts to look more like what we want it to. Now you could pitch the nose down to do that, but it's actually better to reduce power a bit instead, because that'll naturally increase your descent rate and keep your speed under control. We're catching up to our ideal profile now though, and the runway is looking less rectangular than before, and it has more of a trapezoidal shape, and this is what we'd like to have seen the whole way down to the ground from when we turned on final. On the other hand, if we look at this approach instead, I'm coming in way too low just to show you the difference, and the runway looks a lot more squished and shorter than it did in the previous approach. To recover from this, we need to reduce our descent rate, and in this case, I'd actually go as far as to stop descending completely until we get a little bit closer to what our 3-degree descent path should look like. The way we can do that is by increasing power slightly, which will help to slow our descent rate and maintain our airspeed. However, depending on the type of plane that you're flying, power changes can take a few seconds to take effect, so it's not a bad idea to use your pitch to affect your descent rate as well. Then from there, we're watching for the aspect ratio of the runway to start to look more like what it was at the end of the previous approach, and at that point we can get back to our 3-degree descent rate. If you're struggling to hold the right descent rate, the approach lights to the right side of the runway are there to help you, and they'll appear in different combinations of red and white depending on your approach angle. You'll know that you're right on the ideal glide path if you see an equal number of red and white lights, and if you start to drift away from that ideal path, you'll see either more white lights as you get too high or more red lights as you get too low. 3 red or 3 white lights means that you're just a bit too low or too high, but when it goes to 4 reds or 4 whites, you're getting well off the ideal glide path, and it's at that point that you'll need to be a bit more aggressive to catch up. One thing to be aware of though is that the placement of the approach lights in Flight Sim can be a bit off, and it actually causes you to land further down the runway than you should, but I still think they'll be helpful while you're learning what an approach should look like. There are also a few variants of the lighting system with fewer lights or even vertically arranged lights, which makes them more suitable for airports with space issues, but they all work in the same way, and you want to see the same number of white and red lights to be just right. When it comes to the actual landing, on runways like this that don't have touchdown zone markings, I'll try to land just a bit beyond the numbers because that gives me a bit of buffer in case I misjudge it, and it still leaves me plenty of space ahead to stop. When you get a few feet off the ground, you'll bring the throttle back to idle and pull gently back on the controls to start a flare to let the main gear touch down first, and then let the nose wheel come down after that. I don't worry too much about my landing rate though. I know some people do, but the main thing I'm looking for is to just stay on the runway center line. So long as I'm not slamming it into the tarmac, I think it's going to be fine. Another thing that I haven't spoken about much yet is airspeed control, which is important throughout the approach, but especially on final. We want to be flying slow enough so that once we get to the runway, the plane doesn't try to keep flying, which it'll do if you're coming in too fast. You'll often hear that you're supposed to use power to control descent rate and pitch to control speed, but the reality is that you end up using the two of them together more often than not to change your airspeed. We also have flaps to help us fly slower by increasing drag. However, you can only start to extend them below a certain speed, so you'll want to look that up, but it's typically just above the white range of the airspeed tape, and you can only go to full flaps once you're inside that white range. The exact airspeed that you fly on final will also be different from plane to plane, but a rule of thumb that you can use when you're not sure is to fly it at a speed that's about 30% more than the stall speed of the plane. The stall speed is where the red section of the airspeed tape starts, which is 50 knots in the Grand Caravan, so that means that ideally I'd be flying short final at 65 knots, although I tend to try to hold a bit more speed than that until I'm getting closer to the runway. The danger if you get too slow though is that the controls become a lot more sluggish, and you'll notice the plane doesn't want to respond to your control inputs like it would normally. The other thing is if you slow down to the stall speed, you can literally start to fall out of the sky because the plane can't generate enough lift to stay airborne, so you'll want to increase power in that scenario to avoid having your flight end before you wanted to. As you cross the threshold though, you typically want to be about 5 knots below the final approach speed we calculated earlier, so that as you get close to the ground, the plane is only just staying in the air and it'll come down to the ground on its own. Another thing that you have to deal with on a lot of approaches is the wind, which on a light day might have little to no impact, but a strong crosswind landing does take some practice to get right. The wind's blowing across us from right to left, not a complete crosswind, but still enough to be a factor, and if we were to fly the runway heading of 340, we'd end up well to the left of it by the time we got down there. The easiest way to deal with that is to turn yourself into the wind by a couple of degrees, which will help keep you lined up with the runway until you get closer to the ground, and this is often referred to as crabbing into the wind. You can see that right now that we're not pointing directly at the runway, just a little bit off to the right instead, and how much you crab into the wind is really going to depend on how strong the wind is, but a few degrees generally does the trick. Another suggestion that I've seen a lot when you're landing into a strong enough crosswind is instead of using full flaps to use 1 notch less than that, which will make you fly the approach a little bit faster. The theory is that since you fly slower with full flaps, your controls become less effective, so by flying a bit faster with partial flaps, you'll increase their effectiveness. On top of that, in a crosswind like this, once you get close to the ground, you'll want to transition from the crab that we were using to using the rudder and aileron to stay lined up with the runway. What you're looking to do then is to turn your ailerons into the wind. So since it's blowing right to left, that means lowering our right wing and then using opposite rudder to stay on the center line. That way you'll be able to plant the right side wheel first and then level it out once you're on the ground. And this is probably one of the hardest things to do when it comes to landing, and I'm definitely not an expert in it, but I do think it is a lot easier to do with the physics in 2024 than it was in 2020. If you learned something useful today, please make sure to like the video and subscribe as well so that you don't miss out on the next one.